They laughed when he dragged the battered rain gutter across the cobbles and said he was going to make the Brownin' eat like a harvest thresher. They laughed when he asked for baling wire, a hacksaw, and the rear wheel from a German boy's bicycle that had been leaning half-buried in plaster. They laughed when he held the downspout up beside the 50s feed tray and squinted the way a farmer squints at a bent plow like all he needed was a morning and a pot of coffee to make war run smoother. They laughed because that's what men do when fear has made a nest behind their ribs, and the only thing keeping it quiet is bravado and noise. They called him Tin Man Rube Professor, and he didn't mind. His name was Owen Bishop Corporal, 23 son of a Kansas mechanic who tuned combines by ear and could listen to a machine like it was a stubborn hymn. Owen had grown up with his hands inside engines and grain elevators, a boy who learned as much from heat as from books, who learned that anything that jammed usually did so in the same 2 or 3 ways, and that the world could be persuaded if you met it at the angle it needed. They had a Browning M2 set on a sandbagged nest inside the shadow of a bridge that spanned a cold German river. The map called the river by a proper name, but the men just called it the river the way you call a father simply Dad when there are no other fathers around. Week-old mud had the consistency of coffee grounds and stuck to boots with a fidelity wives might envy. The March wind came down the valley in sheets that smelled like iron and apples. There were rumors from the north that the bridge at Remagen had been taken. There were rumors from the south that nothing would ever cross the water but birds. Rumors were a kind of currency and nobody could make change. The nest had been thrown together by combat engineers, and Harvey the gunner had a way of swaying behind the grips that made the weapon seem like a dance partner. To his left, Santos worked the ammo, feeding belts from repacked wooden crates. Behind them, Dixon kept the numbers in his head. Rounds fired barrels, swapped cases piling in the catchment tarp, and Sergeant Avery, who had hammers for cheekbones and eyes the color of a blue winter, checked the sky every few minutes for the black gnats of incoming planes. The gun had a reputation that lived ahead of it like a storm. Men told stories about it the way they talked about boxers and saints, how it could spoil an engine block with a single burst, how it could punch through walls that had been built to survive earthquakes, how the very noise of it put doubt into bone. But even saints have needs. The M2 would run like a clock until it started to eat its own belt, until damp and grit turned each link into an argument, until a twist set the next round at a bad attitude, and the feed paws refused to reason. The belts lay everywhere, canvas and metal coiled like gray serpents that dust loved. The wind would flip them, the mud would chew them, and in a long fight you could watch the smooth rhythm degrade into a stutter, and then a cough, and then the worst sound in any fight, the clack of a trigger on nothing. Owen had seen it in Sicily, had watched a gun go dumb because a belt slid off a plank and into sand so fine it was like flour. He had seen it on the docks at Naples, where salt turned everything into a slow ruin. And when he climbed into this nest beneath this bridge and set his hand on the feed tray and felt the wobble of the belt they'd propped with a ration tin, he felt the same itch under his skin as when he watched a piece of machinery doing its best to fail. He stood up, scanned the wreckage of a house they'd been using as a windbreak, and saw the gutter. It was dented and green with oxidation and still carried a smell like old rain. He shouted for the saw for wire for any clean rag, and the laughter started then. "What are you going to do with that professor build a roof over Jerry? You going to make the Hun pay a water tax?" He smiled because they were his friends and because he knew what he was about. He took the bicycle wheel because what a feed needed more than anything was a curve that the belt could learn as it came. The downspout was the backbone, the wheel was the hip joint, and the rag was just to keep the metal from chewing at the links like bad teeth. He cut the gutter clean a hand's length from its elbow, then shaved its mouth with the saw until the lip would sit close to the feed tray, like a spoon rests against the edge of a bowl. He set the wheel in the crook of the elbow so the belt would kiss the rubber and roll instead of drag. He wired the whole thing to one of the tripod legs that Avery always cursed for being in the way. He threaded an empty belt through as proof of concept and twitched the free end with a finger. It moved like a promise. He spit into the dust, wiped his hands on his jacket, and took a breath. Sergeant Avery stepped in then, because he was a fair man, even when the leash on his temper went tight. "You expect me to trust the biggest gun I've got to a piece of gutter?" Owen didn't touch his helmet brim. He didn't reach for permission as if it lived in any of their pockets. He said what his father would have said. "I expect the belt won't twist Sarge, and if it won't twist, Harvey can keep talking." Harvey grinned and patted the butterfly trigger with one palm like checking the pulse of a sleeping dog. Santos held the next belt up with both hands, the way an altar boy holds a book open. Dixon rolled his pencil across his knuckles and looked down the slope of the riverbank where the willows had gone pale with spring. "If he breaks it," Sarge Dixon said, "we'll still have the old way." Avery scratched his jaw with his thumb and said the thing he always said when the world was asking for a decision made without enough time to deserve it. Let's see what it does when it matters. What mattered arrived an hour past noon, carried in with the wind that had turned mean. The first shells fell short in the water, sending up pillars that hung a second like glass before falling back on themselves, dragged down by their own weight. The second bracket came close enough to bite. A fragment cut a line across Santos' sleeve, and he laughed the way men laugh when their skin is still their own. "You're fine," Harvey said, and then the first truck at the far end of the bridge appeared like a problem looking for an owner. It was German, a flatbed draped with canvas, and on it were men with a machine gun that was not a Browning and had opinions of its own. Avery shouted something Owen didn't hear, because the Browning had started to speak. He knew the language of a good gun. It is not anger. It is not the sound of revenge. At its best, it is the even heavy sewing of fate. The 50 stitched the air in long, deliberate threads that ran from nest to truck and unpicked the day. Canvas opened like a mouth. Tires gave up their air. The truck leaned and tried to choose between stopping and not existing and settled on both. A second burst walked the railing. A third strafed the roadbed where boots had been a heartbeat before. The feed chute did what it had been born for. The belt came up from the ammo box like a snake charmed by a song and rolled over the bicycle tire with a sound like breath, and the links slid into the tray at the angle a good mechanic would shake his head at first and then call perfect. A plane came, a single-engine fighter that dropped from a broken sky and tried to make a line out of their day. The Browning turned and found it, and then the river tried to get inside the nest on the wind, and the bridge shook with trucks theirs and ours. And in the middle of it Santos swore, because he saw what the sergeant had been watching for with that weather glance of his men sliding along the abutment in gray that matched stone, trying to cross below their noses and up the riprap to the foot of the bridge where demolition is a craft and time is always too short. Avery didn't tell them to do anything but the inevitable keep talking. There are orders you say out loud and orders that live in the muscles you've already trained. The first hour ran out of itself like a long pour. Owen kept his eye on the seam where chute met tray. He checked for the small betrayal shavings of metal black crumbs of burnt powder, the hesitation that precedes shame. He rewired a loose twist with his teeth. He tore a strip from a shirt and tied it where the gutter had cut itself into a burr. He wiped the wheel with one pass of the rag and watched how the belt leaned into the curve like a body finding balance on a bicycle for the first time. He swapped barrels when Harvey called for heat and used the asbestos mitt until his own hand gleamed with sweat. He hung the headspace-and-timing gauge from its cord around his own neck so he could set the new barrel blind and fast like a priest who knows the words by memory and doesn't need the book anymore. The second hour came with a different kind of trouble. A mortar crew somewhere upriver had found the range and the shells stepped toward them like a drunk looking for a fight. The fourth landed close enough to fill the pit with smoke, and Harvey's voice came through it like a railroad seen from 100 miles away, straight and steady. Santos fed and Dixon hauled, and Owen held the chute with one palm, the way a teacher steadies a child's bicycle on a gravel road. The belt did not sag. It did not take on the river's grit. It did not twist into the sort of shape that makes a man want to scream. Every third burst, Harvey walked the gun off target and down into the mud to clear the puffs of powder that had begun to hang beneath the mouth, the way a bad habit hangs on a family. The links pinged like rain on a tin roof as they broke and fell, and the broken chain of what had been the belt piled against Owen's boots like wind-blown ivy. Sometime after the third hour started, a lieutenant from another company slid into the pit with a face like a man who'd been told his house was on fire and his dog had done it. "How in God's name are you still running?" he said, and then flinched when a particularly emphatic burst tore a vertical seam in the wall of a building across the road where a sniper had been. Owen tapped the gutter with his knuckle. "She's eatin'," he said, and had the sudden and ridiculous idea that he was talking about a colt he'd managed to gentle. The lieutenant looked at the downspout with the contempt of pedagogy, and then with the dawning sense that some lessons arrive in plain clothes. "Carry on," he said to Avery, half an order and half a prayer, and backed out of the nest with the knowledge that the world would always be larger than manuals. The fourth hour had a texture. You could feel it under your tongue the way a man feels a lie he hasn't told yet. They had been shooting and switching and wiping and lifting for long enough that muscles had become equations, and the pig iron of the Browning had become a fact of weather. Owen's world had shrunk to the lip of the chute. Through the slit of the battle site, Harvey kept finding the small shapes that ruin Bridges' men with sacks that were not lunch and planks that meant somebody expected to cross here without an invitation. The M2 swatted at a boat made of doors and desperation until it was just driftwood and an idea. The gun kicked every time like a mule that knows the field too well and resents the harness. In the pauses between bursts, Owen could hear the river's old song under the new noise, a sound like coins poured from a jar into a larger jar. In the next pause, he heard Avery's quiet laughing, and when he looked up, the sergeant's eyes were on the chute on the bicycle wheel on the wire that had been twisted with hands that knew fences and winter and repairs made because nobody was coming with a new part. When it finally went quiet, it didn't so much end as recede. The river continued to river. The wind remembered it was simply air. The sound inside their heads left a shadow of itself like sun on the back of the eyelids. Harvey stepped away from the grips and sat down very carefully, as if somebody had balanced a glass of water on his helmet and dared him to spill it. Santos lay on his back and breathed the way a man breathes after a swim. Dixon counted the empties because numbers are the string that lets a man find his way back out of a day like that. And Owen set both hands on the chute and was surprised to feel his own pulse beating in the cheap metal as if his blood had gone out of him for a while and taken up lodging in this piece of gutter. Avery came and stood where he could see the river, and also the nest a man used to keep in two realities together without letting either slip. 4 hours, he said, and his voice had that thing in it that men use instead of tears. 4 hours straight. It wasn't a statistic. It was a benediction. The gun had taken breath when it needed breath, but the feed had never failed. It had never argued with its own purpose. The weapon had been allowed to be the thing it had been made to be, because something improvised had given it a chance against the little sabotages that war and weather and chance always try. Avery rubbed his jaw with his thumb, and then took the cigarette from behind his ear and did not light it, because he wanted the smell of powder and oil to live in this moment a little longer. He said, "Anybody still laughing, feel free to do it now." Nobody did. Men are expert at many kinds of silence. This one had gratitude in it. Word got around because word always does. A captain came and stared and said nothing, which is how captains sometimes apologize. A major sent for a sketch, which is how majors steal with credit. A supply sergeant quietly set 2 new barrels in the nest and a crate of oil and 3 extra belts, as long as a Sunday afternoon, which is how supply sergeants court the gods. The next morning, a private from another company came with a gutter kinked at the wrong angle and asked if Tin Man Rube Professor would mind taking a look. Owen took the gutter in his hands the way a man takes a newborn he is afraid he will drop and said, "Let's see what you've got here." The private said they'd called him crazy when he'd taken down a piece of the farmhouse in order to feed the hog, and Owen grinned without letting it reach his eyes. "That's a trick," he said, "being right after they've called you crazy." They left the river when the brass decreed it and moved east, following the long tide of the war toward towns whose names would later be mispronounced at kitchen tables in Kansas and California. In a little place where the church steeple had been folded by artillery like a paper hat, Owen found a trove of bicycles stacked in a furniture warehouse, and the quartermaster signed a form that released an assorted quantity of wheels to a corporal who wrote the word "Chute rollers" in the margin as if it were a recognized noun. In a town where the bakery had somehow survived, he traded a loaf of black bread and 2 tins of jam for a length of stovepipe perfect for a broader curve. In another, he found canvas as stiff as new money and cut it into sleeves so the belts would never again drag themselves toward doubt. He wrote to his father not about death, because what could you add to that, but about materials and angles. You remember the way the elevator belts would twist when the wheat was damp? He put in pencil on paper that tasted like dust. It's like that. The difference between right and wrong is 17 degrees and a surface with a mind of its own. The laughter didn't stop entirely, because soldiers are made of equal parts affection and insult, but it changed key. When a man with oil under his nails came into a new sector, the gunners would say, "We got a professor," and if the answer was yes, they'd say, "Good, because they've been sending weather at us and we've been feeding it right into the tray." The language of the nest grew in jokes that were really instructions. "Keep your belt out of the gutter," men said everywhere, and they meant, "Keep your belt in the right gutter." Tin Man's stories collected barnacles and truth in equal measures, how he built a feed out of a church collection plate and a piece of a Messerschmitt, how he used a child's sled as a winter ramp, how he could hear a belt starting to kink the way a doctor hears a heart valve go off beat. None of it was exactly true, except the part that mattered. He was a man who looked at a problem and saw a shape and a material and a hinge where other men saw only the inevitability of failure. When they finally crossed into places where the uniforms on the ground were gray, and then simply were not, Owen found himself in a farmyard with a horse whose ribs could be counted at a glance, and a girl of 8 who had 2 braids and hands chapped the way winter chaps poor people. The war had taken the horse's strength and the barn's roof. Owen looked at the gutters and laughed, and then stopped when he realized he had laughed aloud in a place where laughter was a language nobody spoke. He pulled the ladder to the eaves and hammered a downspout back onto its bracket so that the next rain would find a path and not a ruin. The girl watched as if watching a stranger who might be an angel, but probably wasn't. When he climbed down, she offered him an egg, one of 3, and he shook his head, and then, because everything is a trade in war and peace, took a single button from his pocket, one he had probably rubbed with his thumb 100 times on nights when he needed a small task, and gave it to her as if it were currency in a world just then inventing money again. Harvey went home to a garage in Ohio where he could shoot pheasants and trouble and paper targets. Santos took his GI Bill to a school where steel could be studied in rooms with chalkboards. Dixon married a woman who loved arithmetic and made pies that were a proof of some theorem about tenderness. Avery stayed in for a while because some men only breathe easily when there are orders to be given and obeyed, and the world felt too loose without a mission brief. Owen went back to Kansas and set his hands in grease because that was where they belonged. He set up a shop with a sign that said Bishop and Son even before he had a son, because you have to make room for that future in case it arrives. He fixed balers and combines and school buses and skeins of wire and pumps inside wells that had been crooked all their lives and needed a man who believed in redemption by inches. In the summer, he stood in fields squinting the same squint and told farmers that what they needed was a curve, which is a way of telling a man that what he owns could work a little better if he loves it the right way. One day, a letter came with an Army crest. It wasn't a citation, it wasn't a summons, it was a typed inquiry about non-standard feed guidance devices observed in theater, and the question was whether he had any notes. He laughed again, softly this time, because the notes lived in muscles and knuckles, and in a scar where the wire had taught his palm about the price of a good idea. He wrote back and drew a picture with a pencil that had been whittled with a pocket knife and sent it to a post office box with a town name that sounded like brass. He never heard back. It didn't matter. He knew what he had built, not a patent, but a permission slip the kind men carry folded in a wallet with edges gone soft to ignore laughter when they need to build the thing that the moment requires. Years later, when he told the story to a boy who had his eyes and his mother's way of holding grief and joy in the same cup, he never started with the gun. He started with the river. He started with the March wind and the apples. He started with the bicycle wheel, and a man who had to choose between the manual and something that felt true under his fingers. He would set a piece of garden hose in the crook of a kitchen chair and run a strand of twine through it and show how a curve can turn friction into travel and a problem into motion. The boy would nod and then say, "But did they really laugh?" And Owen would smile the way a man smiles when he remembers a world he loved, even when it tried to refuse him. "Of course they did," he'd say. "If nobody laughs, you're not early enough." He kept the gauge, though the little strip of metal that said headspace-and-timing, and he hung it on a nail above the bench where he kept his wrenches. On days when the shop was loud with tractors, and on nights when the world was too quiet, he would sometimes take the gauge down and slip the hole over his finger and feel the weight, and remember the way the Browning had talked when it ran like weather. He would hear in his head the exact pitch of Lynx breaking away, and the dry chuckle of Avery's approval, and the wind off the river stamping its own authority on the day. He would remember the click of the bicycle spokes under a belt in a place where there had been no bicycles strong enough for the weight they needed to carry. He never believed he had won anything by himself, because that is not how machines or wars or lives work. He believed that he had been a part of a choir, and that his line had been a simple low harmony beneath a louder song. But sometimes when the news said big words about big things, strategy, doctrine, superiority, he would set the newspaper aside and go outside and stand beneath a real sky and look at the arc of starlings as if they were belts, threading themselves through the night, and he would allow himself the private hope that somewhere the story of a piece of gutter had been told in a room where men made plans, and that maybe in that telling somebody had left a little more room for the next man who would need to bend the world a degree or two to keep it from chewing itself to pieces. Once, years after he returned to Europe as a tourist without quite admitting it, he stood on a rebuilt bridge and watched children throw stones into the same river and heard no mortars in the way the water spoke. He found a museum in a small town where his uniform would have looked wrong and his hands would have been recognized, and in a glass case was a Browning, and beside it a drawing of a feed chute that had been labeled in a hand that was not his. The card for the exhibit called it Field Modification Anonymous, and he felt a pride without edges, the kind that does not need a brass band but accepts one if it walks by. A docent, a young woman with an accent that had more than one country inside it, asked if he had any questions, and he said he had only the one anyone should have, did it work. She smiled and said, "They say it ran 4 hours straight." He nodded then, as if satisfied by a sermon that ended exactly where it should. In the end, the laughter mattered as much as the gun. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest, because most of the world is convinced rightly most of the time that strangeness is a cousin to folly. The useful men and women are not immune to that skepticism. They are simply willing to be embarrassed in the service of something better. Bishop knew that. Avery knew it when he said yes. Harvey knew it each time he let a stranger's invention intervene between his hands and the language he spoke with a weapon. Santos knew it when he trusted that a belt that rolled would be a belt that fed. Dixon knew it in numbers. The river knew nothing and kept moving. It's easy to make a miracle out of it to say the M2 sang because a man bent a gutter into a new vow to write a line that turns war into a parable, to say the 4 hours were an orchestra and the conductor a boy from Kansas with grease under his nails. The truth is both smaller and larger. Smaller because it was wire and a wheel and a willingness to be mocked. Larger because half a world ends up resting on these small corrections, a plug cut whittled to fit a hole that should have been drilled another 1/4 inch to the left. A brace moved one rung down so the ladder doesn't tip. A feed taught to curve. A man taught to trust something he can feel under his hand, but cannot see from the desk where decisions get written. The laughter, the bolt snapping forward the river, the 4 hours the hush after they're a braid, you could put over a shoulder and carry as far as you need.